The Second Punic War lasted for 17 years. At the outset, fortune favored Carthage. The brilliant Punic winning streak culminated in the catastrophic defeat of the Roman army at Cannae. After that disaster, many of Rome's allies abandoned her. King Philip of Macedonia, honoring his pact with Carthage, launched an attack on Roman territory. Even Sicily and Sardinia, provinces Rome had only recently subdued, rose in rebellion. The fate of the Roman Republic now hung by a thread. To survive, Rome had to summon every ounce of its strength and resources to turn the tide of war. Year after year, Roman and Carthaginian armies clashed across Italy, Spain, and the Mediterranean islands. Gradually, however, the balance of victories began to shift toward Rome. Hannibal focused on breaking Rome's alliances, hoping to isolate the Republic and force its collapse. But that very strategy limited his freedom of action. Hannibal's army was constantly forced to rush between his newly gained allies, trying to shield them from Roman counterattacks. Reinforcements from Carthage never arrived to support him. When deciding where to send troops, the Carthaginian oligarchs acted with cold pragmatism. Hannibal's campaign in Italy was not their priority. To the Carthaginian elite, safeguarding existing sources of wealth and seizing new ones mattered far more. That's why they dispatched troops to Spain to protect its rich silver mines, to Sardinia to reclaim the island, and to Sicily to aid the rebellious city of Syracuse, but not to reinforce Hannibal. Only 9 years after the Battle of Cannae did Hannibal's brother Hasdrubal muster an army and march toward Italy. The Romans met him near the Metaurus River in northern Italy. In the fierce battle that followed, the Carthaginians suffered a devastating defeat, and Hasdrubal himself was killed. It was the first truly decisive Roman victory against Carthage on Italian soil. The Carthaginian losses were so great that the Romans called it revenge for Cannae. After years of brutal, grinding warfare, Rome was finally gaining the upper hand. Spain was conquered. Sardinia and Corsica were captured from Carthage. Roman legions gradually pushed Hannibal's forces back to southern Italy. Meanwhile, Roman envoys persuaded the Aetolian League of Greek cities to declare war on Macedonia, forcing King Philip to abandon his campaign against Rome. In Sicily, Roman troops captured Syracuse after a long and grueling siege. Behind many of these victories stood a single man. Years earlier, in Rome's darkest hour on the field of Cannae, a young military tribune named Publius from the noble Cornelian family, later known as Scipio, had witnessed the disaster firsthand. He came of age during this long war, and when both his father and brother were killed in Spain, he stepped forward to take command of the Roman forces there. By 205 BC, Scipio had risen to the rank of consul and was stationed in Sicily. His bold plan was to carry the war into Africa itself, forcing Hannibal to abandon Italy and rush home to defend Carthage. Yet the Senate, cautious as ever, refused to authorize a full-scale invasion and denied him additional troops. Still, Scipio was permitted to raise volunteers and use legions already under his command, the same legions composed of survivors from Cannae, men who had been exiled to Sicily as punishment for their defeat. These veterans burned with a desire to redeem their honor and avenge their fallen comrades. Scipio trained them relentlessly, instilling discipline and confidence. He introduced an improved system of battlefield signals to better coordinate maneuvers during combat. Cavalry, however, remained his weak point. Scipio pinned his hopes on gaining Numidian support once he landed in Africa. A few years earlier, he had concluded an alliance with the Numidian king Syphax and forged a friendship with Massinissa, a Numidian prince. But Carthage countered this move by marrying Hannibal's niece, Sophonisba, to Syphax, even though she had previously been betrothed to Massinissa. This marriage alliance shattered the pact between Syphax and Rome, but it also drove Massinissa away from Carthage. Even so, most of the Numidian forces remained loyal to Syphax. while Massinissa was left with only a small band of followers and discontented tribes. Meanwhile, Hannibal's brother Mago landed in Liguria, in northern Italy, intending to recruit mercenaries from local tribes and march south to join his brother. At the same time, Carthage renewed diplomatic efforts with King Philip of Macedonia, hoping to persuade him to resume hostilities against Rome. Once again, the situation began to look perilous for the Republic. Yet even in these unfavorable circumstances, Scipio resolved to carry the war directly to Carthaginian soil. In 204 BC, the Roman fleet sailed from Olybium and made landfall on the African coast. Upon arrival, Scipio laid siege to Utica, the ancient capital of Carthage. His army numbered only around 20 to 30,000 men, far too few to assault Carthage itself. At that time, the city of Carthage was larger than Rome and protected by 3 concentric lines of formidable defensive walls. Knowing he could not take it by storm, Scipio set out to devastate the surrounding countryside, hoping to draw the enemy into a decisive battle on open ground, and to buy time while awaiting reinforcements from Massinissa. Panic swept through Carthage. The city had no standing army and depended heavily on mercenaries and allied troops, but most of these were still in Italy under Mago and Hannibal. The allies had yet to assemble their forces, but fortune briefly smiled on Carthage. Scipio failed to capture Utica quickly, and while he was occupied with the siege, the Carthaginians managed to raise an allied army nearly twice the size of his own. Facing overwhelming numbers, Scipio had no choice but to abandon the siege and withdraw. From this position of apparent strength, the Carthaginians proposed peace negotiations. Scipio accepted, not because he trusted them, but to buy time while waiting for Massinissa, who was gathering troops throughout Numidia. Convinced that a peace treaty was imminent, the Carthaginian commanders grew complacent and allowed their men to relax. Roman scouts stealthily approached the enemy camps and set them ablaze during the night. At that same moment, Scipio's legions advanced in full force. Panic broke out among the Punic troops, and the army disintegrated as soldiers fled in terror. The Romans utterly routed their foes. Hasdrubal escaped, but Syphax was captured. Soon after, Roman cavalry leader Gaius Laelius assisted Massinissa in securing control over Numidia. The vast majority of Numidian horsemen then joined the Roman side. Crushed by defeat, the Carthaginian Senate once again sued for peace, and Scipio agreed to a temporary truce. Envoys were dispatched to Rome to have the treaty ratified, but their true mission was to stall for time. Even as they left Carthage, secret messages were sent to Mago and Hannibal, urging both generals to return home. But fate turned against Carthage once more. The Romans intercepted Mago's army near Insubria, defeating it decisively and mortally wounding Mago himself. With the remnants of his army, Mago set sail for Africa, but he succumbed to his wounds before his fleet reached Carthage. Hannibal also returned home, though he lacked enough ships to transport his entire force. He brought with him only his hardened veterans, the men who had fought beside him since the very beginning of the war. His cavalry and most of his allied contingents were left behind, at the mercy of the advancing Romans. Soon after the arrival of Mago's and Hannibal's forces in Africa, the Carthaginians broke the truce. They attacked the Roman fleet, sank several ships, and murdered Roman envoys. Meanwhile, Hannibal began mustering his army for what he knew would be the final decisive confrontation. Scipio, recognizing that the situation had turned against him, initially sought to avoid direct battle. He led his forces to join up with Massinissa's army, but Hannibal moved swiftly in pursuit. The Punic commander understood how formidable the Numidian cavalry could be, and he aimed to defeat Scipio and Massinissa separately before they could unite. He nearly even succeeded. Hannibal intercepted Scipio near the small town of Zama, where both armies made camp facing each other across the plain. Hannibal sent scouts to observe the Roman positions, but Roman patrols captured several of them. Instead of executing the spies, Scipio ordered that they be shown around the Roman camp and then released unharmed. Scipio knew that Massinisa's army was close and would soon arrive, but it had not yet joined his camp. When Massinissa reached him shortly after the scouts were freed, Hannibal's intelligence was already outdated. As a result, he went into the coming battle with a mistaken impression of the Romans' army's strength and composition. Hannibal still hoped to avoid battle and proposed peace talks with Scipio, but their meeting brought no agreement. He rejected the earlier peace terms and presented new conditions that Rome could never accept. Scipio, for his part, had no desire for compromise. Now that he faced the legendary Hannibal himself, he longed for victory, not negotiation. He wanted to be remembered as the man who defeated Carthage's greatest general, not as a consul who settled for peace. Battle was now inevitable. The chosen field was a broad, open plain, ideal terrain for cavalry engagements. Yet unlike in his earlier triumphs, Hannibal no longer held superiority in horsemen. Scipio commanded 2 reinforced Roman legions and 2 allied legions, a standard consular army, amounting to about 29,000 infantry once joined by Massinissa's troops. His cavalry included 2,000 Roman equites under Gaius Laelius and 4,000 Numidian riders led by Massinissa, bringing the total Roman strength at Zama to roughly 35,000 men. Hannibal's force, meanwhile, consisted of Mago's surviving mercenaries, Carthaginian militia, Macedonian-style hoplites, and the hardened veterans he had brought from Italy, supported by Numidian cavalry from tribes hostile to Massinissa. He also fielded around 80 war elephants. Altogether, his army numbered close to 40,000. Scipio deployed his troops in the traditional 3 lines, the inexperienced hastati in the front, the principes in the second, and the veteran triarii in the third. However, he broke from custom in one crucial way. Instead of arranging his maniples in a staggered checkerboard formation, he aligned them directly behind one another, leaving wide corridors between the columns. In the front of the infantry, and in gaps between the maniples, he positioned velites, lightly armed skirmishers equipped with javelins. Cavalry occupied both flanks, Roman equites on the left, and Numidian horsemen on the right. Hannibal arranged his infantry in 3 lines. In the first, he placed Mago's mercenaries, Ligurians, Gauls, Balearic slingers, and Mauritanians. The second line consisted of Carthaginian militia and Macedonian allies. The third held his battle-hardened veterans. Numidian cavalry covered the flanks. He also stationed war elephants in front of the infantry formation. Although the Roman and Punic armies were roughly equal in numbers, they differed greatly in composition and discipline. The Roman legions were well-trained and easily controlled, aided by a newly adopted system of signals and commands. Hannibal's army, on the other hand, was a coalition of warriors from many tribes and regions. Orders were issued in several languages, and soldiers from neighboring units often could not understand each other. The Romans had the advantage in cavalry, but Hannibal fielded around 80 war elephants, young and not fully trained. Hannibal did not know his troops well, since most of them had never fought under his command before. He was uncertain of their capabilities, strengths, and weaknesses, and relied heavily on his veterans. Doubting the reliability of Mago's mercenaries, he placed them in the front line so they would have no opportunity to retreat. In his second line, Hannibal placed the Carthaginian city militia, men of doubtful fighting skill, supported by seasoned Macedonian hoplites. His third line consisted of the veterans he had brought from Italy, soldiers hardened by years of campaigning. Scipio's battle plan focused on neutralizing Carthage's greatest advantage, the war elephants. He intended to either frighten the beasts into retreat or to let them charge harmlessly through the wide gaps between his maniples. Meanwhile, Gaius Laelius and Massinissa were tasked with driving off the Carthaginian cavalry. The outcome of the battle would then depend on the disciplined assault of Rome's well-trained infantry. Hannibal's own plan was straightforward but bold. He would unleash his elephants first, using their charge to break and scatter the Roman front line. His 1st and 2nd Infantry lines would then press the attack, while his battle-hardened veterans in the rear delivered the decisive blow. His cavalry's mission was to keep the Roman horsemen occupied and prevent them from aiding the infantry. But the events on the battlefield quickly turned against him. The elephants were the first to engage, charging forward just as Hannibal had ordered. Yet Scipio had faced war elephants before, and he knew their weaknesses. As the beasts approached, the Roman ranks erupted in a deafening uproar. Soldiers shouted, clashed their swords against shields, and blared trumpets and horns. The din terrified many of the elephants, causing several to panic, wheel around, and trample back through their own lines. The very disaster Hannibal had prepared for the Romans now struck his own troops. The elephants, maddened by fear, plunged into the first line of the Carthaginian infantry, throwing it into chaos. The Mauritanian mercenaries and Numidian auxiliaries on the left flank suffered the worst losses. Yet not all of the beasts were driven off by the noise. Many mahouts managed to maintain control and kept pressing forward. As the elephants closed in, they were met with a hail of pila and arrows. Once again, several of the animals panicked, veering away and crashing into the right flank, where they tore through the ranks of the Punic cavalry. At that very moment, Massinissa and Gaius Laelius launched their cavalry assault. Only about half of the elephants managed to reach the Roman lines, but when they did, Scipio's soldiers executed his plan perfectly. They swiftly withdrew into the gaps between the maniples, and then stepped aside, opening clear corridors through the formation. The elephants charged through these lanes almost harmlessly, pelted from both sides by spears and javelins. Driven mad by pain and confusion, the beasts bolted past the Roman ranks and fled the battlefield. Meanwhile, the Roman cavalry had closed in. The Carthaginian horsemen, already disordered by the retreating elephants and outnumbered by their opponents, were driven back and forced away from the infantry line. Now, at last, the main bodies of both armies prepared to clash. The first line of the Carthaginian army clashed head-on with the Roman hastati. The Gauls, Ligurians, Balerians, and Mauritanians fought with wild ferocity, but they were unaccustomed to prolonged combat in tight formations. Their strength lay in swift assaults and individual bravery, not in grinding, disciplined warfare. Their initial charge was fierce, yet it soon lost momentum, breaking against the solid Roman wall of shields. As the struggle dragged on, the mercenaries' fighting spirit began to fade. The hastati not only held firm under the pressure, but even started to push the Carthaginian front line backward. Yet Hannibal's first line had nowhere to retreat. The Macedonian hoplites and Carthaginian militia of the second line pressed against their backs, forcing them to stand and fight. The combat turned into a brutal, close-quarters slaughter. The ground was quickly carpeted with the dead and dying. Though the hastati had withstood the initial assault, their formation was battered and their casualties heavy. The maniples began to lose cohesion. Meanwhile, the mercenaries in the Carthaginian front ranks also suffered grievous losses and looked for a way to withdraw. As they fell back, they collided with the second line, and in several places open fighting broke out between the retreating mercenaries and the advancing hoplites and militia. For a brief moment, the battle paused. Both commanders seized the chance to restore order and regroup their troops. Scipio signaled his men to execute a series of practiced maneuvers drilled long before in Sicily. Following his commands precisely, the Romans reformed their lines, pulled the wounded to the rear, and brought fresh soldiers forward to continue the fight. The Principes shifted to one side, the Triarii to the other. All of Scipio's intricate maneuvers were executed with impressive speed and precision. Hannibal, meanwhile, rallied his shaken troops, using his officers' poles and standards to restore discipline among the mercenaries and re-establish order in his ranks. Like Scipio, he deployed his forces into a single extended line, moving the remnants of his first line to the left flank and placing his veteran soldiers on the right. Now, once again, the two armies stood face to face, both stretched thin, with almost no reserves left to call upon. The lines advanced and the battle resumed. The Romans fought with greater discipline and motivation, while the Carthaginians, fighting far from home with no path of retreat, were equally determined to stand their ground. For hours, the outcome hung in the balance, neither side able to break the other. Meanwhile, the struggle between the opposing cavalries reached its conclusion. The seasoned Roman equites near Gaius Laelius and the numerous Numidian riders under Massinissa first drove Hannibal's cavalry back, then routed it completely. After a long pursuit, Laelius and Massinissa gathered their exhausted horsemen and led them back toward the battlefield. They struck at the Carthaginian rear with devastating effect. Scipio had now repeated the maneuver that once brought Hannibal victory at Cannae, a crushing cavalry attack from behind, followed by encirclement and destruction. Trapped between two fronts, the soldiers of the Punic army resisted fiercely at first, but panic soon spread through their ranks. Confusion turned to chaos, and one after another, Carthaginian soldiers threw down their weapons and fled. Only Hannibal's veterans fought to the last, and every one of them fell where they stood. Those who fled were hunted down and killed. Others were taken prisoner and sold into slavery. Hannibal himself escaped the field with just a handful of horsemen, slipping away at the very last moment. The slaughter raged until evening. At least 20,000 of Hannibal's soldiers were killed and another 20,000 captured. Roman losses numbered around 5,000. Hannibal was defeated. Carthage was defeated. Scipio and Rome stood triumphant. After Zama, further resistance was pointless. Carthage hurried to sue for peace, this time on terms far harsher than those once negotiated by Hasdrubal. Thus, after 17 years of brutal warfare, the Second Punic War ended in a Roman victory. Yet Carthage did not fall, not yet. Though humbled and broken, the city still clung to hope that one day it would recover its strength and once again rule the Mediterranean. If you made it to the end of this video, we really appreciate it if you liked and subscribed. Follow along on our journey through ancient civilizations and history. We put out new episodes every single week. If you'd like to support the channel, join our Patreon or become a YouTube channel member. You get early access to new episodes, behind-the-scenes looks, and more. You can also leave a super thanks below to give us a little extra boost. If you want to listen to history on the go, check out our all-new podcast, Parabellum History. You can find it on all major podcast platforms. Thanks again for tuning in, and we hope to see you next time.